If you can spot the difference between these three images, let me know in the comments section down below. Gentlemen, welcome to Conversion Beam. Today we're going to be taking the Deimos Predator and we're going to make it look at least 20% more epic. I want to say my goal here is to make it look a little bit more cohesive within a Primaris army. It probably wouldn't be too accurate to say I'm trying to convert this into a Primaris Predator, but that's what I'm going to roll with for the video title. So please do forgive my insolence. So I begin by clipping out the bits to make the chassis of the tank, cleaning them before assembly. Being my first time actually building one of these new Deimos tanks, I gotta say this thing is really well thought out. All the bits go together really nicely and they have an insanely tight fit. Despite all that, I still managed to mess up the assembly, leaving some pretty noticeable gaps between the panels. Using rubber bands rather than my silly goose hands would have prevented this. Regardless, I do end up fixing it in just a moment. Now I stopped building the Predator as normal when I get to the front panel. One thing I don't particularly like about the Deimos Predator is this front plate. It just doesn't look quite as cool as the one from the Deimos Rhino. So I'm gonna do a little switcheroo here, and I'm gonna be honest, this made me a bit nervous. I've never seen this done before and I wasn't sure it was going to fit. But I was very happy to find that the fit was almost flush. So happy with that, I pulled out this AK Interactive modeling putty with the goal of addressing those gaps between the panels. I just haven't really been able to find a good use for this modeling putty yet, and I really wanted to just experiment with it. I found it was very messy, but it got the job done pretty well. Placing the chassis aside so I can allow the putty time to cure, I now begin work on the turret. One more thing I really don't like about the Deimos Predator is that dome-shaped turret. It just, to me, it doesn't really fit the Space Marine aesthetic. So I take this chance to use a kit that I've been holding onto for nearly a decade. I feel kind of bad showing this kit off because if some of you want to follow along with this conversion, it's going to be very hard to find this. This is the turret from the Mark IV-C Predator upgrade kit. After a heap of cleaning, I super glue this block of resin together and I decide on my first conversion for this turret, which would be adding this larger, more modern turret hatch with the Primaris body in the middle. So I begin by widening the hole, using the existing turret ring as a guide, which, well, took a long time to do. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be, but at the same time I did kind of wish I had a Dremel. Once it was wide enough, I snip away the existing turret ring and I sand the surface flat. It ended up looking a little bit rough, but the new turret hatch covers it pretty well. With that super glued in place, I stick on a Primaris helmet to really cement this as a firstborn tank, repurposed for Primaris needs. Now for the next part, I'm going to use another old bit I've been holding on to. It's a vehicle mounted missile launcher that I'm going to use as a hunt-to-kill missile. But I actually have no idea where this is from. If I had to guess, I'd say an Astra Militarum kit. If you can idea it, let me know down below. I'll begin by clipping a chunk off the side of the turret and sanding it flat to make a sort of mounting bracket, and then trimming down the base plate for the missile launcher so it can fit on the new space I made. Now I forgot to film this bit, but after I super glued it down, I filled in those gaps using putty and proceeded to sand it flat after it had dried. It does look kind of messy, but once paint is applied, it looks relatively seamless. Before gluing on the missile launcher, I drill a hole into this cable housing. This is because I had an idea to add my own cable later on. I then decided there were more things I wanted to change before gluing it in place. So I removed those Astra Militarum style Aquilas, and I cut the targeting system of a hunter-killer missile to take its place, which I think is rather fitting. While on the other side of the missile launcher, I glue on some veteran iconography. This can be found in quite a few different Space Marine vehicle kits, but I still feel like the missile launcher looked a little bit bland. So I grabbed these resin bits left over from the Mark IV-C Predator, cutting off those circular bits and filing them down to fit more flush on the back of the housing. I think a little bit of greebling goes quite a long way, wouldn't you agree? And then finally, after slotting in the missile, the rocket launcher housing is glued onto the turret. And I think that looks pretty cool, but I wanted to add a bit more greebling to the turret, so I put on a few bits that I absolutely did not steal from my brother's Rogel Dawn battle tank, because that would be very uncool of me. Now I don't envision that jerry can as fuel for the Predator, maybe something more along the line of holy oil to appease the machine spirit. Now to mount this turret to the Deimos chassis, I'm gonna need to get a bit creative. This is because the Deimos turret ring is way too wide for this new Mark IV turret, so I decided to use the base plate for the old Deimos turret, and I'm going to flip it upside down. Now the hole is still a bit too wide, but I'm going to take advantage of these two nubs here. After giving those nubs a little trim, not only do they hold the new turret in place, but they prop it forward just a little bit, which is something I actually quite like in the end result. So after cutting away everything I don't need, I glue this new turret ring to the chassis. Another thing I was trying to achieve using the Deimos turret's base plate was to elevate the new turret. But after a test fit, I thought the height looked a little bit too awkward, so I began cutting and sanding until I brought the height down by around 40%. And after a little test fit, I felt a lot more pleased with the height, so I turned my attention back to the hull. One thing I was really struggling with was to find a position for the storm bolter that didn't break the silhouette of the tank, but I eventually came up with an idea using the storm bolter from one of the Primaris tanks and mounting it in a forward locked position on the tank's faceplate. Now to get it in place, I was going to need to carve a hole into the plastic, and this bit was probably the most stressful part of the build, because I knew that once I started cutting, there was no turning back. So after putting on a fresh blade, my tactic was to kind of slice away until I had enough room to get my files in there, and once I did, it was a lot easier to turn it from a jagged hole into a square, and I just kept plugging away at that until I had a pretty snug fit for the storm bolter. Once it was in place, I doused it in plastic cement, hoping it would help remove some of the gaps, and then turned my attention back to the turret for a second while that was drying, because I realized I totally forgot about that cable I wanted to add. With a little bit of super glue, I jam it into the hole I drilled earlier, and I wrap it around the rocket launcher until it connects into the scanner array. And now back to the storm bolter, which is now dried. I attempt to fill all the gaps in with milliput. Now if you've seen me use milliput in any of my previous videos, you know I'm not great at it, but despite how messy it looks, I think it does come out pretty good. So to add a little bit of flair, making them more unique to my chapter, I grabbed this metal cog that I picked up from the arts and crafts store, and I glue it straight to the loading ramp. For the front of the tank, I get a little bit more creative. I've had this idea I've really wanted to try for a while to get a perfect cogtooth pattern on vehicles. It involves using a 1x3mm strip of plasticard. I start by gluing a strip long ways across the bottom, and then after cutting out evenly sized rectangles, starting from the corners, I glue them on top, and then working out from the middle to get them evenly spaced without having to measure. Figuring that they should be completely dry by now, I take this chance to sand down the milliput and the putty, and then move on to the next step. I start by cutting away the nubs where the headlights are supposed to go. I do this to make way for these reactive armor plates used in conventional scale modeling. I think you can find these in most hobby shops, but they are a little bit expensive. So I will eventually try to find a cheaper alternative, but I think they look pretty cool. So after a ridiculous amount of cleaning, I attach them to the front plate. I don't mind too much if they're not completely aligned, because I wanted them to feel more like field modifications that they never took off, rather than something that was part of the tank when it rolled off the assembly line. And for my final bit of conversion work, I make up a few milliput rivets with the rivet mold, putting a few on the front trim and a few more around the turret ring to make it look a little bit more deliberate. And for the rest of the vehicle, I pretty much build it as per the instructions. Now you tell me, am I being biased when I say this is probably the coolest looking Predator I have ever seen? Because I am really happy with how this came out. Assuming you didn't just skip to this part, thanks for watching the whole video, and I hope to see you in the next one.